Welcome to another ADHD video by Wilhelm. Thank you for stopping on by. So, since the ADHD personality type videos seem to be quite helpful for some of you, I figure let's dive deeper into cognitive functions. Let's see what some of the core difficulties and core strengths we have in our personality type. So, what we're going to do for this series is we're going to go over two different functions back and forth. So what we're going to do is I'm going to make this interesting. I'm going to try to dedicate about 30 or 40 minutes to two specific personalities that share the same dominant function and also share the same inferior function. So we dedicate about 30 minutes or 40, give or take, to those two personality types. And then we're going to do the exact opposite. We're going to do the opposite personality type. We're going to do basically the other two personality types whose dominant function is the weaker function of the other two personality types mentioned. And of course, vice versa, their inferior function is going to be the dominant function of the other two personality types. So in total, 4 personality types will be covered. Basically, out of the 4, 2 will have one dominant function and inferior function, and then the other 2 will have the opposite dominant function and inferior function. That way we can learn how to understand each other and understand the people who are polar opposites of us when it comes to cognitive functions. So, the reason why I'm doing this is because I found it extremely helpful when I found out my dominant functions and inferior functions. So, I want to share it with you guys. That way, life becomes a bit easier. Why? Because we learned what our strengths are. We learned what our weaknesses are. Granted, not all of us are going to have these weaknesses and not all of us are going to have these strengths, but we might have some. And some people we know might have some of these difficulties or these strengths, etc., etc. So I recommend, if you're not in the best of mood, if you haven't eaten or slept correctly or enough, or if you're just in a bad mood, watch this video some other time. For people who have ADHD, for a lot of us, when we're not feeling too good, we become pretty dismissive about quite a bit of things. So this video is not meant to bum anybody out, point any fingers. It's meant to just bring some insight. Granted, sometimes it's hard for us to accept the difficulties that we have. Having ADHD is not an easy life, after all. We go through life having to struggle, going up against neurotypicals in school, in the job market, and just out in the world. And it's not easy. So take this lightly, take it one step at a time, apply that of which you think you need, watch this with a significant other if you need to, and then reflect. Become introspective. Unfortunately, in this day and age, we live in a time when the media really wants to throw in a bipartisan divide amongst the people. Ladies and gentlemen, we are human beings. We're on this planet. We want to thrive. We want to survive. And most of all, we want the equality and happiness that each and every one of us deserves. I urge you to balance out your functions, balance out your emotional and feeling function, and balance out your logic and thinking function. If we want to live in a harmonious manner with one another, we have to balance out our functions. And as people with ADHD, we sometimes have a lot of problems with that, because we've lived a pretty tough life. And I certainly have. And many people I work with have too. So let's be careful. Let's be mindful of one another. And let's help out our fellow human beings. In this case, particularly our ADHD human being comrades. We're only here once. Let's make it a good time. So, with the research that this video is going to entail, we're going to be working upon some research I found from a book entitled Personality Type, an Owner's Manual by Thompson L., 1998. MBTI notes, Myers-Briggs. This is based off the Myers-Briggs cognitive functions. And if you haven't done so already, I recommend you check out my ADHD personality types, the 16 personality types videos, in which I go into a lot of the struggles that the different cognitive functions people of different personality types face. Now, this is not an umbrella term, meaning that, oh, hey, I'm this personality type, so I have to do all these things, and I'm just like everybody else of my personality type. Absolutely not. Within cognitive functions, it shows you that each of the 4 letters in cognitive functions has a different ratio, a different percentage, if you will. So there are billions, millions of iterations of the same personality type. So we differ in many different ways due to nature, nurture, our upbringing, and etc., etc. So take that into consideration. So I'd recommend you go watch one of those videos first, but first figure out what are your cognitive functions, what personality type you have. So there's some links down below where you can get that tested out, and then I recommend you go and check out that video. It's pretty informative. Every personality type within those videos gets about roughly about, I don't know, 12, 20 minutes or so. So once you watch that, then you can come back here and you can dive further into it. This is really helpful if you're dating someone or having to work with somebody or a group of individuals at your work or wherever, and you're not sure of how to approach, how to handle yourself, what you're doing wrong. Maybe that workplace might not be for you. Maybe that partner might not be for you. Maybe they might. So it's healthy and it's helpful to figure out what your strengths and your weaknesses are, and knowing yourself and knowing your challenges is of the utmost importance and a gigantic advantage in life. So I urge you to go check that out. I'll be waiting right here when you get back, and we'll dive on into it. And speaking of diving on into it, let's go into the first set of cognitive functions. Let's dive into it, shall we, folks? First, we focus upon the dominant function of the dominant NE, capital letter N, lowercase letter E. In this case, we have the ENTP, that's extroverted, E for extroverted, N for intuitive, T for thinking type, and P for perceiver. And then we have a similar personality type of the ENFP, that's E for extrovert, N for intuitive, F for feeling, and P for perceiving. So if we notice, the only difference here is the third letter. We have T for thinking in the ENTP and F for feeling in the ENFP. So NE focuses on intuiting patterns in the external world in order to discover new ideas or possibilities with an eye towards taking advantage of any good opportunity that presents itself and making continuous progress. When NE DOMs rely too heavily upon NE, they will identify with NE's activities, using their creative openness to construct the foundation of their identity. Because of this, NE will feel continually threatened by the SI perspective, because SI has the potential to disrupt or shatter one's ego image. In this instance, the inferior function of the NE, in this case, the dominant NEs like the ENTP, ENFP, so SI is focused upon, SI being the inferior function to the ENTP, ENFP, SI is focused on methodically collecting and sorting personally irrelevant facts and details in order to feel grounded in one's own framework of prior knowledge. But NE tends to misinterpret SI as being boring, overcautious, repetitive, or even stagnant and pointless. Ultimately, NE forcefully rejects the SI perspective because it fears that getting bogged down in tiny details is wasting precious time that could otherwise be used for pursuing new possibilities. So, that's quite a bit of information. So, who are the SI dominant types? In this case, that would be the ISTJ and the ISFJ, which we will be discussing right after this, because like I mentioned before, we're going to be discussing the polar opposite personality types, meaning the personality types whose dominant function is different. So, when looking upon the differences and the weaknesses of each of the dominant functions, it gives me quite a bit of flashbacks, because I've worked with quite a bit of people with ADHD, and what I do is I have them work with this examination just to kind of get a reference point for them. And a lot of the issues amongst these different cognitive functions seem to really be similar, because when we have ADHD, A lot of people, especially if they're not getting their condition taken care of, are usually at their worst. Not all the time, perhaps all the time, or perhaps sometimes. And the symptoms and the behavior, a lot of the time, is very similar. So, what can we do? What can we look out for? It's very helpful to know what the difficulty actually is and what is unique onto ourselves as a difficulty, and what is also unique to different cognitive functions of our personality. So, when having issues with your SI function, this is what can happen. Weaknesses of NE dominance, the ENTP ENFP. And these bullet points, you'll notice, really, some of them really correlate with ADHD. Point 1. Weaknesses usually stem from NE-SI imbalances. Second point, having difficulty with managing details carefully or learning methodically. That is a very common ADHD scenario. Sometimes make faulty inferences or pursue unrealistic ideas. This could be ideas that could be stimulating to the unstimulated ADHD mind. Tend to overlook personal needs or priorities because of excessive attention paid to external events. The need for an ENTP or an ENFP with ADHD to constantly go places and be around people can be pretty high. I've worked with a few ENTPs and ENFPs that constantly need to be on the go. They get bored pretty easily, and they have to constantly go out in order to get stimulated. I'm going to talk about the consequences of some of these points after we discuss the points. Can have tunnel vision when they're taken by an idea or possibility. Hyperfocusing can definitely screw that one up. Do not invest enough in material stability or security. Here's where financial issues might come in. Difficulty understanding that making good choices involves methodically examining whether behaviors will actually produce real, tangible progress or personal improvement. Some of the time we might want to aim for goals and ideals that are the most stimulating, meaning that they bring up the reward system the most and make us feel better. Because when you have ADHD and you have a low reward system, you're not taking care of your neurochemistry. Your behavior and activities is basically going to be really driven by not wanting to feel bad. So you might do activities that might be helpful for that are not going to be the most helpful in the long run. It might keep you stagnant in some ways. Rely too much on external sources for mental and social satisfaction. This is an issue I've noticed quite a bit. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with going out on the weekend and doing your thing and going on trips and stuff. It can be fun for some people. But an excess of doing this can definitely negate responsibilities and other things we need to do that are required. And this can make life very difficult. Next point, can appear impulsive, impatient, scattered, unpredictable to others. Impulsive and patient. Those are very core terms when it comes to ADHD that are even spoken about in the DSM-5, Statistic and Diagnostics Manual. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's basically the big book of psychology that therapists and psychologists and et cetera, use in order to help people get diagnosed here in the U.S. Too easily bored, often abandoning plans midstream. Restless. How many times have you heard of someone who has abandoned a project with ADHD? It's a pretty common ADHD characteristic that I've noticed in quite a bit of people. We get really gung-ho to try to get into many projects, we get motivated, and boom, we wake up like a day or two later, or a week later, and we just don't have that motivation anymore. And then you're like, what's next? What can stimulate the mind next? And then we go into some other project, thereby leaving the project behind that we started originally and never completing it. This, again, has to do with neurochemistry. And it could also be a characteristic of the personality type 2. Granted, some of these points can definitely be just because of a person's personality. They don't have to exactly be correlated to ADHD, but if you have ADHD, it can definitely make this worse and crank the bass knob to 11. You know what I'm talking about. Next point, tend to resist, ignore external limits or regulations, a sense of rebelliousness. Again, we have an issue with adrenaline and kind of getting pumped up, so risky behavior and needing to stimulate the brain through neurochemistry. Yeah, we're going to want to do some stuff that's really going to give us a kick or a boost of that adrenaline, that intensity sometimes. So sometimes we're going to need to boost up, you know, we're going to need that feeling of just feeling like, man, we're ready to go. We're feeling good. We're feeling intense. So some people want that. Some people lack that due to neurochemistry imbalance. So what I've read for my ADHD research is that there's an issue sometimes with adrenaline in some of us. A lot of people with inattentive ADHD need to wait until the last minute to do something because you're not stimulated or motivated to do it. So you just wait until the last minute because you have no choice, and then you feel rushed, and you're like, okay, I have no choice now. I have to finish the task. So this can definitely manifest itself in these two personality types. Next point, change priorities as quickly as conditions change. Unreliable. Now, this is where issues in the perceiver function come in, that due to the fact that both of these personality types are perceivers rather than judgers, J's in that instance, J's, judgers, are quite good at getting a regimen or setting a schedule and sticking to it. It's when the individual is unbalanced and is so bound by those things that when problem starts, which we will talk about when we get to the personality types and cognitive functions of the J function. But in this case, the perceiver function is really good at improvising and changing plans on the spot, usually. But in this case, when it comes to ADHD, it can sometimes be hard to stick to a plan or stick to a regimen or stick to a promise perhaps you made. So this can create a lot of issues and can make the individual double book, meaning that they make plans with multiple people and they sometimes might flake on one person, or they might flake on both of them for something else that might be more stimulating to the mind. So one's got to be careful about that. The next point, more interested in exploring potential than realizing potential, i.e. having trouble implementing ideas/plans successfully. So when it comes to being an intuitive and being a perceiver, there's going to be that intuition to go into the mind and see the different possibilities of what could be. Using that perceiver function, you're able to really almost free flow and see a bunch of ideas and see situations and things in manners that perhaps other people might not. Unfortunately, sometimes these things can be unrealistic and can be very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. Not all the time. I know plenty of intuitive perceivers who have absolutely amazing plans of innovation and have done these amazing things with innovation. I believe wholeheartedly in innovation and in pushing the limit forward and bringing upon a positive change. I am not someone who believes that that's the way it's always been done, we got to keep doing it like that. Absolutely not. I wouldn't be making these videos if I was under that belief. Life progresses. We gain new information and new knowledge. We have to modify, we have to improve, and we have to refine. And we have to learn and implement the knowledge. And sometimes it's a little hard to do that because the truth and knowledge is not always a popular thing amongst people. Especially these days when the media has trained people to go a little haywire when they receive information that they're not conditioned to like. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, behavior and thoughts and whatnot are all conditioned. The more you see something or do something, the more conditioned you're going to be inclined to do a certain action. So we need to refine the mind and guard the mind from unessential facets that manipulate the mind. We need to keep the mind sharp, and we need to keep our critical thought sharpened as well. And we need to balance out our emotions. For those of us who have issues with empathy and don't have enough of it, we need to work on that. And for those people who have too much empathy and just go full-hearted with feeling, it's not going to work either. Both of the extremes are going to lead to unsuccessful negative results. It's truly with balance that we can really refine our lives and improve our lives. So, next point, high pressure to explore novel ideas means they are often overextended and commit themselves to too many things at once without completing anything satisfactorily. Yet again, going in with double booking and making plans because you're in the moment, you feel really good. You want to make plans with somebody, you're connecting, right? And then you completely forget you have made plans with maybe one or two other people. So what ends up happening is, if the condition isn't being taken care of, or if the person hasn't balanced out their personality cognitive function, they're going to choose the ideal or the situation that's going to be most stimulating, and sometimes disregarding the importance of those that are a bit more essential, perhaps. There's a hierarchy of decision making, of importance. There's a hierarchy of importance when it comes to making decision making, and unfortunately, sometimes those of us with ADHD cannot choose that of which needs to be done the most because it's not stimulating enough. So we need to do something else instead, and then we might forget or just might not have the neurochemistry and the stamina in order to complete what we need to do. And this can lead to a lot of issues. And it can also lead to a lot of procrastination for a lot of us. So next point. Depend too much on others for practical/material support and therefore have trouble developing a realistic sense of their own strengths and limitations. So in this instance, if we look for other people sometimes, and especially the media and other stuff, to be our guide, it can be helpful in some instances, and it can also be downright very problematic in other instances. If you deny who you really are in order to compensate and try to please someone or please a group of people, and you deny your core foundation, according to research, you're going to experience what's known as grip experience, where your shadow personality type will come and take over. And this could depend on the person. How long this takes will depend on the person. But if you keep denying who you really are, what can occur is eventually you're going to explode internally. And then the functions that you have in cognitive functions that are not well trained are going to take over you without you really knowing it. So you're going to flip. Every letter in the four functions is going to flip, and the version of yourself that is least trained is going to come out. And that usually is a very negative individual who is really, really troublesome or can be troublesome. And every personality type has a different shadow personality type. So it can be really troubling. We see people sometimes completely flip, and some people stay there for years. Some people stay there for days, and some people only stay there for hours. And some people can manage it better than others, but we got to be careful because of that. So in this instance, in this point, we got to watch out not to deny who we really are. We need to refine who we are and balance who we are. Granted, we can't just be like, this is who I am, take it or leave it. No, absolutely not. We need to balance ourselves out and become an optimal version, rather, of ourselves. And that is what I hope to help many people do. Because I've noticed a lot of people, especially a lot of people with ADHD, need a lot of guidance and a lot of help sometimes. A lot of the time, actually. So, with knowledge and with implication and with discipline and with balance, we can do a lot of these things. We need to take care of the ADHD first. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard to do all of these things. So, that's something to aim for. Something to make a goal of. Let's talk now about environments or ways of which the ENTP ENFP can get triggered. And this can happen at the home, at work, or whatever it is. So if you're an ENTP or an ENFP listening to this or watching this, take note. These points are very important because they're going to help you not throw a fit or not get really upset if you're in a certain environment for too long. It might also help you in guiding what relationship you might get into, what job you might work at, whether you should stay or leave a job, and what might be a better job option for you. This is really helpful. I really found a lot of help reading through these different cognitive functions. So let's talk about the ways that the ENTP ENFP can really feel harsh in a certain environment. Any DOMs can be emotionally triggered in a variety of ways, such as being judged as having no substance or depth, being seen as unreliable or incompetent, feeling unprepared for an important event or task, having their knowledge of facts doubted by others, being called out for being careless or overlooking details, having to deal with too many details or small, practical, logistical matters for a long period of time, dealing with bureaucratic red tape, having a personal value disregarded or violated, being overwhelmed by work, slogging through long periods of repetitive/procedural work, dealing with excessive routine/rules/restrictions/structure, feeling a lack of change/variety, tight deadlines or onerous supervision, lack of intellectual or environmental stimulation, working alone for long periods of time, being surrounded by negative or apathetic people, working in a poorly managed environment where people do not appreciate ideas for improvement or progress. So if we look at those instances, those are things to look out for. When you're going to go into a career, if and when you do decide to go to college or university, whatever field you get into, you want to utilize your strengths of your personality type. So whatever field or career you decide to get into, you want to utilize your strengths, and you want to try to diminish elements of which are going to be troublesome to you. So if you're an ENTP ENFP, there's usually a desire to be in a somewhat more fast-paced environment. Not all ENTPs, ENFPs are extremely social. I've worked with a few ENFPs who are not that social, and same with the ENTPs, and vice versa. I've worked with ENTPs and ENFPs who are extremely social. So it all depends. And the type of ADHD that one has can also really make a difference within that. Usually those of us who are inattentive ADHD, not all of us with inattentive ADHD, but a good amount, are not the most social people. And this is due to the neurochemistry and the reward system and feeling drained a bit more easier than other people. So with these elements to look into, we have to watch out. We have to be mindful of what our strengths are and what our weaknesses are. If we're going to go into a career or job, it's got to be something that feels fulfilling, or our intrinsic interest or our genuine interest feels fulfilled, where it doesn't feel like we're just doing a job. Unfortunately, granted, when you have ADHD, sometimes the career choice options that we have are low because we weren't able to perhaps move up the corporate ladder. It was harder to get an education and perhaps get a type of job that you would desire. But the way I view it, if the person gets their ADHD under control and really gets their cognitive functions under control, I really believe that they can turn their life around. I'm a testimony to that. I was able to turn my life around. And I believe many of you, if not all of you, can do the same thing. Granted, we're all in a different stage in life. We're all in a different road in life. All of different ages, different backgrounds. It's the beauty of the uniqueness of the human mind and the human being. So if you're an ENTP, ENFP, aim for something that's going to work for you in life. Now that you've heard or seen some of the deficiencies and problems that are mentioned in this list, if you see something for yourself that applies to you, you're like, man, I have difficulty with that, and maybe that too. That's something to work on. Write these issues down and find means of trying to improve them. If you haven't gotten yourself evaluated for ADHD, I highly recommend you do. You'll find a local psychiatrist, your healthcare professional in your area, and get yourself diagnosed. I have a video on supplements and what they can do and how they help people with ADHD. I have a video that also talks a bit about medication and some of the different things we can do in order to help the medication work to its best potential. So work with your psychiatrist and healthcare provider. Talk to them, ask them about these things before you try any of them. It's really helpful to have your neurochemistry on check. It helps you get your life balanced out, and it helps you have the pace, or more of a pace, that's going to be suitable for you. And if you get your life straightened out and you get that pace going and you get yourself into a career where your cognitive functions, your dominant functions are going to be utilized, you're going to feel quite good. Ideally, you're going to feel quite good. Same thing if you eliminate being in places or environment where your weaknesses are going to be poked at, so to speak. I've been in many environments throughout my life where my inferior functions and the difficulty that I have and my strengths have all been jumbled up, meaning that I've been in environments where my dominant function has not been valued. It's been valued either very little or not at all, or just disregarded. And I think that's very sad when an individual's strength, in certain instances, is disregarded just because of the sake of, can't do that because that's just the way it is. That's unbalanced S-like thinking right there, which we will be going over in a bit. So, if you're an ENTP, ENFP, you have issues of organizing yourself, get some sort of regimen, find someone who is similar to you in cognitive functions, look at the different interventions that they utilize for themselves, start implementing it. I recommend an analog clock so you can see time and manage time better. You can see the physical representation of time, a clock with hands and numbers, not a digital clock. You need to be able to see the spatial dimensions according to ADHD research when it comes to seeing a clock. I recommend using alarms on your phone. I recommend having some sort of board in your room or your place of work where you can see the goals that you need to accomplish. If you have issues of hyperfocusing and getting stimulated by different things, I have a video also on hyperfocusing and managing emotional outbursts of different sorts. Getting the emotions under control is highly, highly important. Balance your mind out. Seek your career or field that's going to be able to utilize your strengths and is not going to trigger your negative emotions and negative aspects. So we have to be mindful of ourselves, and we have to be understanding that different people have different skills, and not everybody is like us. And other people need to be understanding of that too. Life is not a one-size-fits-all sort of scenario. We are all unique and we are all different, and that's what makes us us. And since we have ADHD, a lot of us do, we got to make the best of it. Especially if we have friends and family members, and especially if we have kids. If we're responsible for a group of people at a place of work, and we have other people depending on us, we owe it to ourselves, and especially owe it to those of us who are working for us, or our kids. We owe it to them to at least try to be the most optimal version of ourselves. Reflect on that. If now isn't the time for you to become introspective and reflect on that, and perhaps some other time, save this video if you'd like, to digest it further. It's a little hard to talk about these things for some people, and I completely understand that. But once we put a regimen and we put discipline and we have a desire to improve and we know what our problems are, and if we get our ADHD under control, I have no doubt that many of us, many of you watching, can completely turn your life around. And I hope that many of you, if not all of you, do. Because we deserve it. People with ADHD, we live a pretty difficult life a lot of the time. We deserve to feel happy. Most of all, we deserve to succeed in this life. So if you're an ENTP or an ENFP, take hope in the fact that if you get yourself refined, if you're able to find a system or regimen that works for you and you get your ADHD under control, absolutely, you'll be able to accomplish a lot of the goals that you have. And if they're unrealistic, you need to refine them perhaps a bit to make them more realistic. Because we're all in a different scenario in life. We all got our unique difficulties. A lot of us with ADHD, a lot of the same difficulties, but these things vary. So take hope, put your head up, start working on a system or regimen that works for you. And if any of these points hit home for you as an ENTP or ENFP, start working on them. I value the innovation of the ENTP and ENFP. I really, really admire people who want to help change the world in new ways that have not been done before. So, ENTPs, ENFPs, I believe in you. And I'm sure a lot of your family and friends and colleagues probably do too. And if they don't, well, that's okay. We gotta believe in ourselves. We gotta rise up. And we gotta go and conquer that goal. So what are you waiting for? ENTPs, ENFPs, go and knock those goals out. I believe in you. So, now we're going to focus on the SI dominant personality types. And now it's going to be flipped. These two personality types are going to be NE inferior, which was the strong function of the prior two personality types we mentioned, the ENTP ENFP. So in this case, the SI DOMs are NE inferior. So, with the ISTJ, we have I for introversion, S for sensing, T for thinking, J for judging. With the ISFJ, we have I for introversion, S for sensing, F for feeling, and J for judging. So, pretty different personality types. Let's dive into them. SI focuses on methodically sorting through personally meaningful information. It scans the physical environment looking for familiar sensory details for the purpose of orienting oneself to a new situation. When SI DOMs rely too heavily upon SI, they will identify with SI's activities, using their past experiences to construct the foundation of their identity. Because of this, SI will feel continually threatened by the NE perspective, because NE has the potential to disrupt or shatter one's ego image. So, ultimately, SI forcefully rejects the NE perspective because it fears that the possibility of future change will destroy one's cherished way of being in the world. And without that personal foundation of familiarity, one has no way to feel grounded or secure in life. So, this can be quite difficult because when you have an unbalanced S, it's going to be really difficult for you to accept innovation and new ways of doing things. You're going to be more akin to doing stuff the way it's always been done, and some people can become extremely stubborn. I've worked with a lot of different personality types over the years, and have unfortunately worked with some pretty unbalanced personality types. And, it's all different sorts of people, but I've had my fair share of individuals who are sensing types who do not like the innovation I bring forth just because they don't have the function to see it that way. And that can be a problem, because that can keep a company, especially if an IS, or an SI DOM rather, is in charge of this company, or is an authority figure. This can definitely bring issues, because it can keep a company stagnant and not utilize new interventions or new systems that SI DOM probably doesn't want to do. That might be the boss. So this can be super problematic, and it can create a very narrow way of viewing life and a very narrow way of handling life, much to the detriment of those around the SI DOM. So, let us now look at the weaknesses of the SI dominant personality type, that is the ISTJ ISFJ. The weakness usually stems from SI and E imbalances, as we spoke about earlier. So we dive into the first point. That's have trouble enjoying the moment due to fear of the future. Now, when it comes to ADHD in certain situations, or for a lot of us, a lot of situations, anxiety can definitely be a problem. A lack of serotonin, a lack of reward system of the brain can definitely cause a ton of issues with anxiety. I've worked with quite a bit of people with ADHD who really suffer from anxiety, and it's very unfortunate. This is due to imbalances in the reward system and issues with serotonin in this case. So, only attend to information that is useful to themselves. Myopic. This is where the narrow-mindedness sometimes comes in, that regardless of whether the information brings upon you new helpful insight of ideas and what they can do, if it doesn't fall within the S framework, it'll be disregarded. And yeah, that's what I was talking about earlier. So we need to watch out for them. Next point, uncomfortable with change, uncertainty, ambiguity, behavior perceived as inconsistent or hypocritical. So again, this comes with a sense of anxiety of just not knowing, not being able to prepare a system perhaps, or have a mindset prepared for the unanticipated, that of which hasn't arrived rather. So when you have ADHD, this can definitely be a problem because anxiety sometimes can be really high. So that can definitely be an issue for this personality types, and there can definitely be a lot of conflict with other people who perhaps want to bring forth different ideals in different situations, or who see life differently in the workplace or in the family, either or. So this can be very problematic. Next point. Tend to lose sight of objective reasons for actions/decisions and excessively focus on their own personal priorities, overly subjective. This again can arrive from a letter J function that is so sharpened, meaning that the regimen that an ISTJ or an ISFJ can have can be so well and disciplined and all, yet the S function might overshadow other essentials and necessities that need to be done. It's just blocks off, or might do something passive aggressive perhaps from the ISFJ perspective, in order to shut out or stop any sort of other view or opinion that might come into some places. Granted, this is not all ISTJs or ISFJs. This might happen to some. So if you are somebody of that nature and you have other people working for you, understand that you need to be more objective. You need to see the differences people have in life and the differences people have in perhaps the work environment that you're at. Life is not a one-size-fits-all. You are not going to be able to create a full-on system that's going to encapsulate everybody you work with. I have been to places where certain individuals only select employees or people who are exactly like them. I have been to places where people of the J function they're the ones running the place, and they only choose people of the J function to work there. And usually those environments can be a bit anal. So it's unfortunate. I really admire people of the J function for their discipline to a regimen and the schedule. That's something I myself have needed to work on. But we cannot let that override the needs and the essential aspects of other people, and the essential aspects that are rather necessities that different people have. We need to become more objective and see the variety that is in life and in situations and in people. We cannot coerce everybody to view and act like we are. That's not how life works. So if you're someone who has issues with that, that's something I urge you to please work on. It's going to make your life a lot easier, and it's going to be much more healthier and tranquil for you to see that and for you to accept that. So, granted, if you're somebody that's in charge and has a certain regimen or certain requirements that you have at your place, then that's fine and all. But that needs to be known up front for the people who might be working at this place. So, because some people need that. And some people need that more than others. But overdoing these things can definitely be harmful, even to the ISTJ or ISFJ. So that's something to look out for. Next point. Difficulty understanding that making good choices involves careful consideration of future possibilities and finding better methods, i.e. progress does not come simply from adhering to established rules, methods, or procedures. I'm going to read that again because that is a problem I have seen with a lot of Si doms. Difficulty understanding that making good choices involves careful consideration of future possibilities and finding better methods, i.e. progress does not come simply from adhering to established rules, methods, or procedures. Just because it worked in the past does not mean it's going to work again in the future. It might completely fail for all you know. So if you're somebody who's an Si dom who has issues with that, and you think it's your way or the highway all the time, and it's always going to be the same, and this can only be that and that can only be this. You need to refine yourself. Your S function is unbalanced. And you need to balance that out. Because guess what? Life is going to become really problematic. People might not want to be around you. They might want to just stop hanging out if you're talking to you. You might lose your job. Your company might go under. The list continues. We need to have an open mind to know, in this case, that the J function and the S function combination can be a little troublesome, especially when those two letters are unbalanced in these two personality types. Because we're going to want to have that regimen and that discipline, that that judging function might be sharpened, and we're going to do stuff in routine and do it well, and we might scold and get upset when other people don't follow along or do it exactly how we do it. Then you have that S function that sees that as the only way to do it. And if the S function is unbalanced and is really subjective, and there's not much intuition, meaning that you haven't seen that life is not fully black and white. Absolutely not. And the life is not black and white. It is shades of gray. There is so much variety to people, so much variety to life, and so much variety to everything that we do. So we need to come to terms with that and understanding the uniqueness of certain situations and understanding that this is where the J function needs to be balanced out and come in touch with the perceiver function more so. To be able to improvise or be able to understand that you need to wait sometimes for things to occur and happen and then take the action needed, because you're going to have gained new insight and new information that you otherwise would not have gotten had you just done your situation or your action right away. Because when something happens, I always got to do this. That sort of thinking can become very troublesome. It might be helpful in a certain year, a certain month, in a certain era, but stuff changes. Life is a constant changing ordeal. So we have to learn how to manage and how to see life more objectively in this case. So if that's an issue you have as an ISTJ or as an ISFJ, that's something you might want to work on, because it's going to help your life become a lot more smoother. You're going to get less temperamental, and you're going to get less friction from other people. And if you have RSD, yeah, that can be pretty hard too, because you might feel bummed out or might feel pretty harsh frequently. So if you become more objective and learn how to work with people and understand people a bit better and not just judge them based off your J standard along with your sensing standard, you're going to see there's different ways of doing things. And you yourself might come up with a different solution, a different remedy, or a different tactic. And this might help you and the people you work with thrive. And this can be in a family, and this can be in a workplace. And if you're an ISTJ or an ISFJ that grew up so disciplined where your parent did not show you love and affection unless you did something exactly the way they wanted, that can be so hurtful. I have worked with multiple people, multiple SI DOMs, ISTJs, ISFJs, who I've noticed have an issue with that. That their parents didn't show them love, appreciation, or affection until they did a task and did it exactly the way the parent wanted. And they weren't encouraged in the earlier stages. They were only given maybe a slight pat on the back or, a decent job. Now go on to the next thing. Folks, when you have ADHD, situations in life and tactics that we do, they're very difficult compared to neurotypicals. If you are a parent who's an ISTJ or ISFJ who has a kid who might have ADHD, or if you yourself have ADHD, we need to be mindful of this. We need to be encouraging, even in the early, middle stages of our son or daughter or ourselves working on something. If you're someone who only gives yourself credit and props and gives yourself positive reinforcement when you finish something, you might want to balance that out more. A lot of people need positive affirmation, need words of encouragement. Good job, you're doing really good, keep it up, let's keep going. Because without that, they feel pretty harsh. If you have ADHD and RSD, then you're going to probably feel really harsh. I've worked with some people at the J function that I can see can sometimes be so hurtful to perceivers because they don't understand them. And they want them to do things exactly the way they know according to their standard and their regimen. I think that can be pretty hurtful, and I don't think the person deserves that in some instances, or in a lot of instances sometimes. So if your J function is a little too rigid on yourself or on those you work with or your family members, I urge you to balance it out. It's going to bring a lot more peace, harmony, and understanding within the family dynamic, within the work environment and the working dynamic. And if your S function is so narrow, or if it's really rigid, and if it's my way or the highway, or I just view life my way, you need to learn how to become more objective. You need to learn how to become more introspective and go into your mind and analyze and think about these situations and not just jump to conclusions right away. Because when you have ADHD, sometimes you don't feel good. So jumping to conclusions might be such a natural thing you're used to. This takes time. This takes effort. But as an ISTJ or an ISFJ, you have that J function to create a system and a regimen that works for you. So in this case, I would urge you to create that system for yourself. Find somebody who's similar to you, who's able to work on themselves in manners of which is helpful for you. Because I've noticed from research and from people with the J function I have worked with, they really get help from seeing a system of another individual that also works for them. So if you find somebody or a YouTube channel or something online that helps you out, a system that's already established and that you would like to follow, if it's healthy for you and helps you out and helps your family and those who are working with you out, give it a shot. Become introspective and reflect. It's crucial and very important. Next point, can appear inflexible, dull, dogmatic, rigid to others. This goes back to the point that I was just talking about, so I don't really need to elaborate more on it, but understand that to some people, SI DOMs can come off as really rigid, ununderstanding, and just if you don't do stuff exactly how I want it, you're gonna get fired. And you might just give them negative reinforcement of some kind. We need to watch out because of that. Again, this has to do with objectivity and subjectivity. Subjectivity being the way we view life, objectivity being the overall manner in which life is viewed in philosophical terms. So you might want to read a little bit into philosophy of objectivism. You might want to read a little bit into philosophy of the objective value, of the objective view of life. It's really helpful to be able to view life from different perspectives and not only your own, because not everybody views life the way we do or the way you do. So you need to be understanding of that. Next point, prefer to handle details themselves rather than delegate. Distrustful. I have worked with quite a bit of ISTJs and ISFJs that, due to one reason or another, have difficulty trusting other people. And they pile on so much work upon themselves that stresses them out, and then they can become even more moody or angry, and sometimes even passive aggressive against other people. Don't take on more work than you're capable of. With ADHD, a lot of the time we have issues with trust because a lot of people have not understood our condition. A lot of us have gotten diagnosed later on in life with ADHD, so this is something we need to take consideration to. We need to be wise in who we have work with us, obviously. But at the same time, we cannot be so distrusting that we want to take everything on ourselves. That can be pretty overwhelming. And if you're not feeling good that day and your ADHD is not being taken care of, you can get outright intense and negative and very moody and can make other people feel quite bad. So we need to take that into consideration. You need to be able to organize and take on work that is manageable for you. Granted, sometimes we need to overwork and work really hard, and that's absolutely fine. But we need to be able to manage and balance, and if we're working somewhere, not take everything on ourselves, but be able to work with certain people. And speaking about what's expected, how you deliver the information is so crucial and so important to so many people. So if you have trouble delivering information or opening up, that's something you might want to look further into. That's something you might want to work on as well. Because it can be very tough. It can be very tough, especially if you've grown up in an environment where it's like, unless you do stuff the way it's expected, you're going to be yelled at. You might not be shown love or affection until you do the task exactly the way a parent wants it. And a lot of people, the J function, come from those family environments, and it can be really hurtful. But we need to overcome that. And we need to refine and balance ourselves so we can help those around us and not cause them any more harm. Because a lot of the time, people with ADHD, we can be really hurt by a lot of those things, especially if we have RSD. So that's something we need to be careful about, and we need to try to improve. Next point, stick to their own plan, sometimes irrationally, even when the results come out negatively. Tend to persist in what they should give up or what they should persist in. Stubborn. This goes along with what I was talking about earlier. And it's unfortunate, too, that sometimes some people of this cognitive function, some SI DOMs, can be so persistent in wanting to keep doing things the way they've always been done, that even if statistically speaking or if factually speaking, stuff doesn't work or their system doesn't work, and they keep doing the same thing just because they're stubborn, this can be very troubling. If you have a family, if you have people who are dependent upon you, this is something that needs to be worked on, that needs to be balanced out. Because bringing people down with you just because you're stubborn and that's the only way you know how to view life, granted, before, if you weren't aware of that, that's one thing. But if you see this video and if you're really analyzing and becoming introspective and have really now taken the idea to heart, well, now you know. Now it's time to work on that. Being ignorant about one thing and acting a certain way is one thing. Being knowledgeable about that one thing and continuing to act that way is a completely other thing. So now that we might be more aware and know, we need to work on that. We need to aim to balance that out. Next point. Get easily offended if people do not honor the same principles, value as they do. Nitpicky. Again, an issue with a balance of the sensing function for some ISTJs and ISFJs. Not everyone is going to view life the same as you. Not everyone is going to value the same things you do. Some people aren't going to care at all about things that you care about highly. And vice versa. You might not care about some things that other people really care for. We need to be understanding of the fact that we are different as human beings. We have different tastes, we have different tactics and different behaviors and different things that we do when different situations occur. There's the beauty of variety in life. We cannot coerce everyone to have a worldview and to love and like the same things that we do, or to hate and distrust the same things that we do. Everyone comes from a different background, a different environment, and a different upbringing. And we have a lot of variety that we bring to us. To coerce or think that everyone needs to think exactly the way we do is very troubling and a very narrow way of looking at life. So if you have issues with that, that's something I highly encourage you to work on. It'll make your life a lot easier. And it'll make the lives of those of you who live around you or who are around you, it'll make their lives a lot easier and tranquil. More harmony and more peace, and a lot of the time more prosperity will be done because of this. Tension can really, really destroy a work environment and can bring down a business. Because people got feelings, people got their emotions, and they got their views. People can only be stepped upon or stepped on so many times before they rise up and do something about it. So if you have an issue with this, I urge you to work on it. Next point. Can forcefully take over others' responsibilities, overbearing. This goes back to a point we spoke about earlier about needing to take on all the tasks themselves because they feel people are incompetent or can't do it themselves. Well, in this case, that can be for a variety of different reasons. We need to look upon whether the reasons we're doing that are actually helpful or not. And if we need to refine, let's say we work somewhere and we're in charge of hiring people, if we need to refine that filter that we need to hire people, or refine the characteristics or requirements and skills needed for that job, if we need to refine them, absolutely, go right ahead. The point is, you want to aim to acquire the necessities of which your workplace, your home, your life require. A lot of the time that requires modification to foundations and systems, that of which we perhaps have had our whole life. You're going to be going up against a giant wall, so to speak, in your mind. So it might take a bit in order to go through it and then go on and start creating a system that might work for you. So it's possible. And I believe a lot of you watching can definitely do that. It's within our capability. If we balance out our cognitive functions and get our ADHD under control, it is definitely possible. Next point, can overburden themselves with helping others and neglect their own health or feel guilty for having their own needs to sacrificing. So, yeah, this can definitely be a problem. I work with a variety of different ISTJs and ISFJs where I've noticed sometimes that they'll do so many things for other people, but they're not going to be taking care of themselves. And this can be a really big problem. I've noticed this a bit more so with certain ISFJs I've worked with. And they can exhaust themselves. And if you're an ISFJ watching this, be careful not to overexhaust yourself with different responsibilities, because then you might get upset later on and become passive aggressive to those people who you feel are not being fair to you. And this can be pretty intense, so we need to be careful about that. Same thing with the ISTJ. It's a little hard to talk about our desires and our feelings sometimes because we feel like they might not be as important. But it is important. You are important. Your needs matter as well. You need to become introspective and reflect upon that of which you have difficulty with, or that of which you need more of. And it's okay to ask for help and assistance and say sometimes I need a break, or I need guidance. I know there's a sense of honor sometimes amongst some people in not doing that, but it's perfectly fine to admit that you need assistance, help, guidance, and you have uncertainty in certain areas. So, balance yourself out. And try to aim to help those around you do the same thing. Open up your S function to more variety and understanding that life has a lot of variety, and there's people who have all sorts of different varieties and different behaviors and cultures and how they handle themselves and whatnot. So we need to be understanding of that, just like other people need to be understanding of us too. The aim is to balance out the cognitive functions and to help out our scenario and to be understanding of those around us as well. Next point. Easily embarrassed if they do the wrong thing. Too concerned with appearing proper, image conscious. When it comes to this point, it can be very troubling because if we need to keep up a face or keep up an image that we're more than perfect, for some of us that might think that, that's really stressful. Because you're not going to be feeling it on some days, especially if you have ADHD. And if you go somewhere, and if you have RSD with ADHD and something triggers you and you just snap and boom, there goes your image. Rather than projecting a false image of what you are not, refine yourself and present yourself for who you genuinely are. But at the same time, be considerate of other people and of the situation and of the manner of which you do it. But I urge you not to continuously try to put up an image of what you are not, especially if it requires a lot of stamina and a lot of effort, because with ADHD, there's going to be a time where you're not going to be able to keep that image up, or that projection of yourself up, which might lead to grip experience where your shadow personality type comes out because you're overworked from trying to create an image of yourself of which you are not. So we have to be careful about that. Next point. High pressure to maintain inner stability can lead to irrational fear of change / risk, as well as paralysis when faced with major decisions or important turning points in life. So in this manner, we have the combination of the sensing and the judging function, that the sensing function, in this case, only knows what it knows, and the J function is so disciplined to do stuff in the system of which it knows that it can make other things and other possibilities pretty scary sometimes. Because an SI Dom might think to themselves, I'm not ready for that. I don't know how to view that. How would I even prepare for that? You need to balance out your perceiver function if this is the case. And understand that life has a lot of unexpected turns and unexpected events. Out of all the performances I have played as a musician, as a speaker, and essentially all sorts of different entertaining things over the years, I can tell you wholeheartedly that a good 70% of the time, what you have planned that you're going to do does not happen. Either because of the place that you're playing at, somebody doesn't show up, another person plays shorter or speaks longer. It's just, you have to be ready for the different outcomes in life. So, as someone who might be an ISTJ or an ISFJ, what you can do is you can create a system yourself for these unpredictable events sometimes, where you'll have a system in place for certain details, where you'll have a certain system in place for certain details, and the other ones you're just going to have to wait until the information comes out. And that's okay. So what you have to do in this case is you have to balance out your perceiver function and understand that life is really unpredictable and has all sorts of turns and things that occur that one might not anticipate. What we can do, especially if you are an ISTJ or an ISFJ, is that you can learn to develop a system in which you'll have certain things ready to go, and then other things you'll just have to wait until the new information arrives. That's balancing it out. And it's really helpful. That's the way I've been trying to help myself out, by managing that and balancing that. Being able to use the perceiver function to improvise, which I've had to learn how to do a lot in my life, and also using that J function to stick to a regimen once you create it. But then being able to modify it if I need to. Let's say the drummer doesn't show up, or the bassist, got distracted learning how to read or something like that. I'm just kidding, bass players. I love you. So, one of the band members. Let's pick on a band member that's not picked on. The guitar player. Let's say the guitar player, for some reason, fell asleep and just never came to the concert. You're going to have to learn how to improvise without the guitar player. So the keyboard player might have to do the parts that the guitar player did. So that's just a musical example. But we have to learn how to improvise, and we have, especially if we're working in an environment, we have to know and understand that certain other people can do some of these tasks that the other person that didn't come or arrive can do. So then we can just switch, or we can settle for something else. But we have to be flexible in this area, because if we're not flexible, if we see stuff so rigidly and handle our decision making so rigidly, it can cost us a lot in the end. It can be very troubling. Next point, difficulty integrating knowledge that is seen as unnecessary or unrealistic. This comes for the perceiver function imbalance in the ISTJ, ISFJ, that if they haven't seen it or haven't really experienced it, or if they haven't seen somebody else do it, if it doesn't basically have the logistics behind it, it can be really hard to believe that it's a possibility, and we might disregard some really good ideas because of that might really help us out. So we need to be more open to ideas and be able to talk to people who have these ideas, and not just be so dismissive and be like, that's not possible, never seen it done, not going to happen. With that rigid way of viewing life, you're really going to have difficulty succeeding in a lot of areas, and it's going to bring you a lot of difficulty, especially if you're working in charge of quite a bit of people. So we have to aim to balance that out in order to bring upon different helping tools. that might really help us out in the long run. Granted, new ideas aren't always the best, but we need to refine it and be wise in what we choose to do, or in how long or in when we implement this new tactic. So I encourage you to help yourself in balancing that function out. So if you are a ISTJ or ISFJ, there are, according to this research, multiple manners of which you can feel quite harshly and can be triggered. So I want to talk about that so you're aware of this, so you can help yourself in your decision making, and even in the deciding where you're going to work at, who you might get into a relationship with, or you might not get into a relationship with, and etc., etc. So these are some points to consider. SI DOMs can be emotionally triggered in a variety of ways, such as being contradicted by someone who is not in touch with factual details, hearing people reject factual data, being reminded about past mistakes or embarrassments, making repeated mistakes, hearing suggestions about implementing useless or unnecessary changes for the future, dealing with people who are deemed impractical or unreliable, lack of follow-through from others, feeling unappreciated for their hard work or responsible nature, being criticized for being inflexible, being interrupted, being forced to deviate from plans or routines without warning, being forced to confront completely unknown/new situations, chaotic/noisy/disorganized environments, situations where there are no rules or where the rules frequently change, having to improvise or brainstorm without warning, being overwhelmed by responsibility, yet unwilling to delegate or relinquish control over details, or feeling pressured to extrovert. So in this instance, we can see that the ISTJ and the ISFJ really value a system that is known, that has its standards, that has its requirements, so the ISTJ and ISFJ can know what they need to aim for. If an ISTJ or ISFJ works in an environment where the rules keep changing and where they sense a feeling of imbalance, of where stuff just keeps on changing and there's not a foundation that someone can hold on to, there's not a reference at that point. That can be very troubling, especially if they feel underappreciated or feel that the person above them in authority doesn't have the knowledge of facts the way perhaps an ISTJ or an ISFJ would. So also being triggered perhaps about old mistakes and things of that nature can be pretty troubling too. So as an ISTJ or an ISFJ, it would be helpful to look for a type of work environment where your strengths are going to be utilized and where you're going to know what is expected, and there's going to be a consistency in that expectation, keeping in mind that we need to balance out to understand that there's different viewpoints in life and in the work field and your coworkers and people that you work with. So it's about balancing that out. You're going to want to get yourself a career where you're going to be able to use those strengths and you're not going to feel underutilized or you're not being taken into consideration. So these are some things to look for if you're an ISTJ or an ISFJ. Reflect upon these things. Some of these points might hit home. A lot of these points might hit home, and some of these points might not hit home at all, and for some of these points might not hit home at all. So we need to reflect and become introspective and open up our minds to the idea that life is not as subjective or as narrow sometimes as we might view it. Rather, life is objective and has a lot of variety, and there's a lot of variety in decision making and the tactics of which we do stuff. What's always worked in the past is not always going to work in the future, and that's okay. We just need to work on a system, if you need to, as an ISTJ or ISFJ, that's going to help you work and help keep your anxiety under control and help keep your emotions under control. Understanding, too, to have a bit more trust of people. You can be selective if it's an important task, you can be selective in who you're going to have help you with that. That's okay, especially if it's of major importance. You want somebody competent who you can trust. But being so untrusting of people that you put the workload on yourself is going to be really troubling, because at one point you're going to overwork yourself and then you're going to end up treating people worse than you otherwise would, and you yourself are going to end up feeling worse which is ironic because by taking the workload on yourself, you're trying to avoid feeling bad from somebody else messing up. But sometimes, regardless, you might end up feeling bad because you're overworking yourself and you're not really aware of it. So we need to try to balance that out and aim to work at a place that's going to really use our strengths, and hopefully where our weaknesses will be refined. So if you're an ISTJ or an ISFJ, really aim to become introspective. Reflect upon yourself and your decision making. Reflect upon these points that we just went over if you need to. And understand that as an ISTJ, ISFJ, there's a really good discipline in a lot of ISTJs and a lot of ISFJs. That they have this motivation to succeed and help the workplace and for the greater good of the company and those working with it. And those are qualities I admire. I admire the J function's mastery a lot of the time of creating a regimen and sticking to it. I admire the S function, knowledge of the outside world of external information and being able to utilize. But at the same time, I admire innovation. And as an ISTJ, ISFJ, sometimes that might be difficult. So aim to balance that out. Balance out your cognitive functions to improve your life and improve the lives of those around you. ISTJs, ISFJs, I truly believe you can do that. With that disciplined J function, you can definitely come up with a system to help yourself out and help out those around you as well.